do you account for the order of magnitude difference in the relative frequency of homicide amongst African Americans as opposed to the society as a whole?
This is a really big question, and I felt important that Dan and I address it in our book and in our prior work. Partly because it's so important to understand. The fact is out there, the statistics are out there, and it's really, really important to try to understand it in non-essentialist terms. So I'll tell you my interpretation of this. There's a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in his memoir, Between the World and Me, in which he talks about the youth that he grew up with in Baltimore. And he describes them as being dangerously afraid. And that's a very unusual expression. You normally think of people as being either dangerous or afraid. You think of people as being courageous or cowardly. You don't think of these two things necessarily in the same breath, concatenated in quite that way. But one of the ideas that Dan and I have been exploring over the course of many years is the idea that once you think about preemption, the way that Schelling described in his work, people who are fearsome, people who, of whom other people are afraid, ought to be fearful because they are going to be targets of preemptive violence. Similarly, people who are afraid are actually dangerous because they are the ones with the greatest incentives for engaging in preemptive violence. So when you have a situation where people are armed, this is why I'm focusing on the flow of guns, across borders, across states, especially if the origin is with a legal owner. You may have no incentive at all to engage in deadly violence other than self-protection. But that's a pretty powerful motive. And of course, if you follow the reasoning that Schelling identified, expecting other people to hurt you through self-protection itself creates an incentive for you to engage in preemptive action and so on, up the hierarchy of belief. So you can get a situation when there's a climate of fear, people are going to be quick on the trigger. And if they're quick on the trigger, that further incentivizes and entrenches that tendency. Now, the one other thing in this equation, which we haven't talked about, is drugs. And you had a colleague, I think Jeff Myron was a colleague of yours at
Boston University many years ago.
So Jeff Myron has an interesting quote in one of his books where he says that, when you have transactions between people where disputes cannot be settled in the courts because the transaction itself is illicit, guns substitute for lawyers. So he talks about guns as being a substitute for lawyers. If you're having a transaction over some legitimate purchase, a real estate transaction, you'll go to court. Right. You'll hire a lawyer. If you can't go to court because it's a drug transaction, you take the law into your own hands. And so drug policy and gun policy are really intimately connected also in this way. And we saw it in Chicago. There's some literature that suggests that, the Prohibition era, in Chicago and other places saw a spike in gun violence. And there's other work in South Carolina where restrictions on the sale of alcohol were associated with an increase in gun violence. But
let's go back to drugs, okay, and the inability to resolve disputes in a court of law, leading to a kind of state of nature in which the disputes are resolved by force. But let's go back to the preemption point, because if I'm going to use that to explain differences between ethnic racial population aggregates and the frequency of homicide, I need some kind of multiple equilibrium feature to the escalating self-fulfilling belief. The fearsome person should be fearful because people who are afraid of him are motivated to take action in advance of him being able to inflict damage. And the fearful person is a dangerous person because they are inclined to get ahead of the game. Is it possible to think about that observation in a way in which you can account for two different communities resolving that spiral of potential violent interaction in dramatically different ways?
Yes, but it's not, the answer is not from multiple equilibria. The answer is to do with differential clearance rates, homicide clearance rates. So if you look at the rates at which murders are solved, So this is, I'm so glad you asked this question, because you cannot understand this phenomena without thinking about homicide clearance rates, witness cooperation, and the possibility of being killed with impunity. This is absolutely fundamental to the argument. So you look at homicide clearance rates in Chicago, Baltimore, they're a third, well under a half. Other communities will have clearance rates, murder clearance rates up 70% or upwards. So there's a big difference in homicide clearance rates, and it's a racial difference. So there's a Washington Post database actually that tracks this with, I think, about 50,000 homicides or more now. And you get a very large difference in the likelihood that a murder will be solved if the victim is black, as compared to the likelihood that the murder will be solved if the victim is white. Now, why is this? So there's two different answers to this. The community answer, or the answer, that you hear from some quarters, is that the police and the authorities and the administration of cities don't care. They care less if the victim is black than if the victim is white. There's less resources invested in it, in solving the crime, and so therefore the clearance rate is lower. But it's very important to also think about the law enforcement answer. So if you ask law enforcement, why is it that you have a racial disparity in homicide clearance rates? Why is it that black Americans can be killed with impunity to a much larger degree than white Americans? The answer that you get from law enforcement, at least that I have seen from studies.
We should mention Jill Leovi's book Ghettoside.
It's a brilliant,
which is a very close account of law enforcement interacting on homicide cases in Los Angeles.
It's a brilliant
maybe
book.
5 years ago or so, but it's a very important book.
It's a very important book. But there are also studies from Los Angeles and other places that ask for a law enforcement response. Why is it that the clearance rate in community A is so much lower than community B? And the answer you get from law enforcement consistently is witness cooperation. You cannot solve a murder unless you get witness cooperation. And without the witness cooperation, you're going to have these kind of disparities, and people do not cooperate with us. If the victim is black, it is quite likely that the witnesses will also be black. They don't want to cooperate with us. This is the law enforcement view. And so therefore we cannot. We have obstacles. We have burdens that we don't face with white communities, where we get much more witness cooperation if there's a murder. Now, with regard to witness cooperation, why is there less witness cooperation? Here, again, you have got two narratives that are very different. One has to do with a sort of a general cultural ambivalence with regard to police and the anti-snitching norms, and just generally the idea that snitches get stitches and so on. So you have this, and one can look at it in cultural terms like you have described early in this conversation. One can think of that as a cultural trait. But there's another very basic fundamental reason why you might get less witness cooperation, is because of generalized aggression in police practices that are not related to homicide at all. So, for example, there was a Department of Justice investigation of the Ferguson Police Department after the killing of Michael Brown,